And now for our final speaker before we close out what has been a pretty remarkable day, I would love to introduce Mitchell Toomey, who is over here, who is the director of the SDG Action Campaign and one of my favorite people here. So welcome, Mitchell.
Somehow I secured the sought-after last spot on the agenda. I'll try to go quickly through my slides, but I have a basic important message for you. Just a little bit of background. I joined the UN 12 years ago. It seems like it hasn't been that long, but I was in the private sector before in marketing and communications, and everything was governed by numbers. Everything, you had to hit your numbers, you had to speculate on what the numbers would be, and then you had to bring proof about your numbers and even more proof, and then there was still some speculation about where you got your numbers. And I know many of you are in that same boat. At the beginning of this day, I think you might have heard the number 2 billion and 700,000 as far as targets for the UN by the end of 2017. Let's make 2 billion people aware of these goals, and 700,000 active engaging in those goals. And you know, the UN is always good at setting ideals and aspirations, but sometimes we struggle to figure out exactly how to measure those things. And when you talk about awareness, when you talk about eyeballs, and we talk about those kind of things, there's an industry for that, and you guys are that industry, trying to find ways of measuring things that are in some ways not measurable, and using new technologies and other things that have come along to make that a little bit easier, and to start to quantify some of these things like outreach. So we've worked in the, just a bit of background on this campaign that we have. We started off as what was called the UN Millennium Campaign, and that was for the Millennium Development Goals, which were kind of a precursor to the Sustainable Development Goals, but starting in the year 2000, really focusing on tackling the most absurd, extreme deprivations in the world, you know, extreme poverty, hunger, HIV, and so on. And it was really about channeling aid to those countries that needed it most desperately, and making sure that it was the political will was there on both sides to step up and do that. So we did things the old-fashioned way, may I say, you know, parades and marches and campaigning, culminating in something called Stand Up, which was just kind of this open source model where anybody who was acting on the MDGs on a certain day of the year would do this stand up for X, stand up for their project, stand up for their goal, whatever it might be, and then report in on how many people actually did take part in that activity. And so we got into the, you know, hundreds of millions of people numbers, but it was really, okay, so people stood up, and it was great, and it was a big moment, and it made a lot of press in the developing world, and it became something of a rallying cry and a reminder every year of these goals. But there was no kind of what we call now data exhaust. There was nothing coming off of that whole exercise that would give us any insight into what was working or what might work better next time. But it was still very important because it activated a lot of partners. It gave partners a way to, you know, do something with the UN, something tangible. We turned that kind of momentum into something called the My World Survey, which, has anyone heard of the My World Survey? It's, you know, like very popular within the UN crowd, but it's not widely known. 10 million people around the world took a survey, and you know, that's a big number, and it's a neat idea. Each person provided about 10 data points, so 100 million data points. But this was different because we were attempting to drag the kind of advocacy world into the measurable space. You know, what would it actually look like if you not only told somebody about the goals or these, you know, potential goals, but asked them, you know, what was their preference, you know, what kind of goals were they most passionate about for them and their family, and collected some demographic information. And by doing so, we took this kind of unformed, kind of subjective campaigning model and made it measurable, and used that data to bring into the negotiations and actually put on the table, here's the people's voices. The research shows that in these countries, people are worried about education. In those countries, women under 25 are worried about this and that. And so that starts to sound like something you can relate to. It's like all of a sudden we had demos and numbers and things. And it turned the civil society organizations who went out and did this campaigning into kind of data collectors and kind of part of the measurement system. And it was very promising because it legitimized this kind of advocacy in the kind of more quantifiable era that we're entering into. And the SDGs are all about measurement. There's like 160 indicators, and within that, 200 or so measures, KPIs as we may call them. So, you know, when we look at big numbers like a billion, we start by going back to what we tried to do to get to 10 million for my world. And this is a funnel going back and forth a couple times. If you recognize conversion rates and social lift and so on, we figured out that if we wanted to get to 10 million, by media, it would be about 400 million or so impressions. Hopefully getting a lot of virality and everything else to that. It wasn't really realistic, and frankly, at the time, it wasn't. And we were still in the mode of the UN thinking, oh, the people of the world are just going to stand up and tell us what they want and celebrate the fact that this is an open process and everything. But the exercises we tried to do, including co-branding, we had it was the Scouts and Coca-Cola. They were all given their kind of custom branded, co-branded version of the outreach tools. And still, it was really hard. It's really hard to get people not only to pay attention, but to actually sit there and fill out a survey, which is, even with a couple of questions, was a lot to ask. So we did end up relying more, going back a bit. Still, 80% of this was offline. People filling out pieces of paper, advocates, volunteers running around ISIC and other organizations like that, leveraging their networks and their groups to go out and collect these votes and dump them into spreadsheets and send them in and so on. And so we're kind of in the stone ages of this, but it's a ridiculously ambitious challenge, asking everybody in the world what they want. And we proved that you can start, and even now with the kind of limited technology we have and the kind of the expectations of the UN, which are very abstract and high level. Let's face it. I mean, this is not a quantifiable science, the science of social change. But we started to see the hints of it, and I think that it's starting now to sink in that in order to be really effective, we have to be able to measure it and baseline it and so on. So this 2 billion number becomes something, I think we can actually do it, but we need your help. We need media professionals to help us write the narrative about what that actually looks like. So how do you measure that? Now the surveying was kind of a backdoor into measurability. So we wanted to, it's kind of like couponing or sweepstakes or something. You have to put something out there that people can respond to so that you can see a signal that comes back and use industry standard measures for the conversion rates and everything to back into a number of overall awareness. And so we get it. We understand that concept, but how do we actually scale that in every market? So just in the interest of time, looking at a funnel, like a conversion funnel. If we're going to try to do this right, we're going to have to do it with the most modern approaches and technologies available. And this is another, a pleading cry to you to help us figure this out. But in every country, if we want to get to 2 billion, that's basically 29% of the global population. So you take any market and look at how do you get to 29% of that market and get to an awareness number. So in the U.S., that's 94 million, and if you want to get to those 700,000 activists, that's actually 32,000. So it starts to sound kind of more tangible, and we could go to media, pro bono or partners and say, could you help us build a plan that would not only get us to that number, but show that we're leaving no one behind, that we're hitting all the demos and we're hitting all the communities and everything. And those kind of off the grid or off the map, we can get our volunteers to go out and talk to them. But if we wanted to get to that bulk mainstream and get beyond, the reason the 2 billion, by the way, is you get beyond the kind of the early adopters. You get into the mainstream once you hit 30%, and then you start to get into the zeitgeist, and it just becomes something that everyone knows about. But it requires a big media plan. It requires a lot of clever thinking about how to get there and how to include everybody. And so we're starting to scratch at the surface of it, but this is where it's a very simple call to action for you, the quants. I know we've talked a lot about the creative coming from the media side, but media is a numbers game too, and there's a lot of volunteerism that we need to incite by coming at you with that. So some specific requests. How do we ensure that we leave no one behind, including the most connected to the most vulnerable? So there's a whole span there. We want to get the whole of society. Can we use sponsored placements? Like what's the best practice in doing this? How can we legitimately show the numbers coming back? How can we record this not just as impressions or potential views, but using things like surveys and other things that actually show an actual conversion that we can build back from? So we've got a number of tools and a number of kind of calls to action that we support as this campaign. Our organization works with David Nabarro and others here in the UN to kind of create those coupons, to create the sweepstakes, to create the activities that people can actually do and insert as their calls to action so that you can back into those basic measurement systems. So we look not only at, we phrase it in accountability and monitoring. How's your government doing? Are you satisfied with this? Like kind of the BuzzFeed kind of, can you name the top goal of your administration and so on. Anything that we can do like that, and testing which messages work, and then doing more and more of those. Storytelling using VR. I think we're going to have a little reception after this. You can see some of the VR movies that we're building that kind of build empathy, like you can visit a Syrian refugee camp and other things. But signing up for a VR screening, I mean, doing a VR showing at your university, any number of things that we could promote simply for the reason of having a call to action that can be measurable, right? So we have to do these things. We love doing them. They're the creative side. They're a lot of fun. But really, we're desperately trying to get to these numbers and show that we've actually done so systematically. So the big, I'm sorry, that's the slide I was just talking about. So, the My World survey is this kind of the universal gadget that we're using everywhere. We're training all of our UN teams around the world, media partners, civil society organizations, and it's basically a library of questions, really good subjective questions about, have you experienced crime in the street in the last 10 days, or have has anyone in your family gone hungry or gone without a meal? We've got about 70 or 80 questions that social scientists have given us. We open those up to partners and social media platforms and others to make sure that we have this, these enticing things that people can participate in, so that they get, they participate, they have a sense of ownership, but also that we can measure them for. And this is kind of a high level. I hope you guys are going to get these slides, because there's a few things I'll skip over here. But the feedback loop, like knowing, not just providing your input, but actually us saying congratulations, this agenda was signed, your hard work paid off, and so on, and providing that full tour. So in the interest of time, just go through a couple of things here. So we are also very fascinated with measurable media like YouTube, and we did a partnership with them to try something out where they, they're losing some of their influencers to other platforms, and so they're trying to create premium programs to keep the big influencers on their platform. One of them was to be an ambassador, and work with the UN and be a YouTube change ambassador and get briefed by the UN and talk about UN issues and things. We thought it would be a great idea to do that and see what kind of numbers we actually get. If you tell young influencers to go talk about these issues, do they actually pull in numbers that we wouldn't have been able to otherwise? So we did a campaign with a number of young influencers, great young women from all over the world, different markets, and then they learned about the goals, and then they did their own interpretation of a call to action for young women. And it was interesting. We did it around the first activation was Women's Day in what was it, March. They all put out videos. There was a hero video made and everything. Google, actually, it's hard to see, but we actually got on the homepage. It says, supporting the UN global goals, which was a great piece of real estate. But what does that actually mean? What does that turn into? Well, they ended up with 4.5 million views of those videos, and 300,000 engagements, 3,000 unique video responses. And so suddenly we have some data, right? We can see, is it worth going and doing a big deal with YouTube or another platform to try to get their influencers on, or is this going to be something that's more boutique and occasional? So we're trying, and I know that you're probably doing the same things with your clients, is to get them into these measured media that's much more easy to predict, and you can pay by click and other things. But this is where we need your help. We're just desperately trying to scratch into this. So how can you help? If there's quants out there that want to help and think about planning and look at different markets, like what would 29% of the Detroit market look like, and how would you go into that? And it's a great way to spread a challenge like this out across. If you have global organizations, like who's doing Thailand? Can Thailand come up with their quota? What would they do? And we'll take it very seriously. If anyone has a media plan, we've got UN offices in all those countries, and we'll be happy to hook you up with the local office and do a big campaign, get the government involved, and make a big deal out of it. But it's not going to be one-off. It's not going to be a big bang. It's going to be lots of markets everywhere, as you know. You don't launch a global brand once. You launch it locally thousands of times, and then you accumulate that into a global picture. That's what we're going to need to do as well. But the way that we hope we can work into that is not only help get your input on these plans, but also create these calls to action that you can, we're joining the UN and driving people to participate in whether it be the surveying or the doing other things like creating a photo exhibit of people in your town and what they're thinking of, what their priorities are, like a creative exhibition. Youth debates. This is something that ISIC does a lot, and other youth organizations. Drive traffic to these youth debates. Whatever it takes to just get that measured data. What are people responding to? Are they responding better to calls about the global goals, or do they really need to hear about specific goals and targets? Doing exhibitions, whatever it takes to get attention. What are people signing up for? Also sharing the best practices. So then our job is to go to all of our country teams and all of our partners around the world and say, this is working, in middle-income countries, this is working, that's working, et cetera, and become a research partner for our operations around the world for 15 years. So consider this an open challenge to you, and here's some contact information. We're serious. We do this with lots of partners. We rely on your expertise. We give you very manageable things to share with your teams. It's not like let's boil the ocean, but it's rather can you give me a plan for this city? What would it look like? What's worked there in the past? What kind of research are you willing to share? And how can we get these results? So I'll stop there. It's been a long day. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mitchell.
Thank you.